Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Welcome to the Daybreak Asia podcast. I'm Doug Krisner. There certainly have been tremendous swings in the oil markets over the last 24 hours. Now, the situation in terms of the war with Iran has been dynamic in both words and actions. Early in the Asian session on Monday, WTI crude oil rose to nearly $120. And that in turn prompted G7 finance ministers to say they were ready to take any steps necessary to support global energy supply. Well, then, Monday afternoon in the U.S., President Trump told CBS News the operation with Iran is very far ahead of its initial 4 to 5 week time frame. And Trump went on to say he's considering taking over the Strait of Hormuz. Now, the president's remarks to CBS came after the oil market closed in New York. However, the equity market was still open and share prices staged a pretty dramatic turnaround. The S&P 500 ended higher by around 0.8% after having been down 1.5%. For a closer look, let's bring in Bloomberg's Stephen Stapczynski. Stephen is team leader for the Asia Energy Group, and he joins us from Singapore. Give me your sense of what you've been observing in the oil market lately.
You know, I think what we've seen is a lot of anxiety because we're in unknown territory. The Strait of Hormuz has never been shut for this long before. It's been over a week. Likewise, we're starting to see output cuts from Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, as well as the UAE, ADNOC, they're large producers also adjusting supply. So all of that together is putting us into an area where the market has never had to deal with this before. And the big unknown is how long does this conflict continue for? It's really unclear, even after Trump's statements, whether this is going to be a quick reversal or if this is something that could continue for several more weeks or a month. Now, the market is betting that Trump is going to perhaps be able to wind this up relatively quickly. He made some comments over the last 12 hours stating that lots of the operations are done and effectively the U.S. has won and there's more winning to be done. But he also wants to provide some guarantees for the market as well. All of that together is a lot of lip service, whereas the market is waiting for actual action. Brent opened this morning in Asia 10% lower, which indicates that there is some of that anxiety has been easing. But as long as the Strait of Hormuz remains shut, it provides about 1/5 of global seaborne oil supply. And if that doesn't open again quickly, then potentially you could see oil prices rise again if this doesn't get resolved.
Is it not important to point out, in terms of the context of this story, that right now there's essentially a global glut in oil?
That's a really good point. And I think that's part of the reason why it's only been in the last 24 hours where we saw that spike in oil prices and then fall again. Last week, the market was relatively subdued. While prices were rising, there was some anxiety. You do have to remember, like you said, that we are facing a glut. OPEC Plus has been adding more supply. U.S. oil output has been very strong. There have been other producers outside of the Persian Gulf area that has been adding more oil and barrels into the market. And because of all of that, you're seeing a much different sort of market today than potentially would have seen if it were 2022, for example. In 2022, you saw a really large reaction to Russia's invasion of Ukraine because the market was much tighter. Now, there is an expectation that they would be able to weather this if they're able to make a resolution or if this war in Iran were to end relatively quickly. But again, uncharted territory. It's unclear how long the Strait of Hormuz will remain shut, but at least in the short term, the market will be able to weather it. The only issue is some of the people that have to pay for it are those in the emerging world. They're paying higher prices that they usually can't afford, and also, to some degree, energy shortages.
So, Stephen, is it your sense then that volatility is likely to continue? We're not out of the woods, so to speak, yet?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think when you talk to the traders, when you look at the market action over the last few days, volatility has come back. And it's actually I would say that the volatility in the market had been subdued or getting more subdued over the last few years. There was a lot of volatility in 2022 with the war in Ukraine. That sort of began to ease as more oil entered the market, as the market became more balanced. Now we're back in basically the volatility era that we saw about 4 years ago. And if you just look at what happened over the last 24 hours, oil prices spiked, WTI, the U.S. benchmark, spiked to almost $120 a barrel and then fell down into the $80 barrel range. It was a $38 range, which is quite unheard of and harkens back to some of the swings we saw 4 or 5 years ago, and also during the COVID era when oil prices went negative very briefly. So I think because there is so many unknowns, you're going to see people latch on to Trump's statements and words, and also perhaps his deeds and what he actually does and how the U.S. acts. And you're going to see not just people bet on that, but also algorithmic trading. People who are fear of missing out the FOMO trade, where they see prices rise and they want to jump into it. So I think volatility definitely is in the cards, at least for the foreseeable future.
Do we have a sense of whether or not oil infrastructure in the Gulf has been impacted at all? A lot of what we've been describing here has to do with the flow of energy on tankers, but I'm wondering about the infrastructure per se.
That's a really good question, because we have spent a lot of time talking about the Strait of Hormuz, which is really important. But theoretically, if that were to, if there was a peace deal, traffic could resume through the strait rather quickly. Now, if there's any infrastructure that's been impacted, if there is any damage to facilities, suddenly this isn't just a quick fix. You can't just restart everything. This takes more time. You have to have maintenance. You got to bring in new parts, spare parts, crews from overseas to do the repairs. Now, the good news is that there doesn't seem to be any major damage to key facilities. There have been attacks on facilities. The world's largest liquefied natural export facility in Qatar had been attacked, and they had to shut that plant last week. But Bloomberg analysis of satellite photos shows that the main facility remained intact, and there was no meaningful damage that we could see. Likewise, there has been a large refinery in Saudi Arabia that was shut, and there have also been attacks over the weekend, strikes on Iranian oil infrastructure, the storage in particular, which again, these are small depots that don't necessarily affect the flow of oil. So the market, I think, is still weighing everything, but the risk, the fact that there are still tit-for-tat retaliatory strikes between Iran and its neighbors, it has slowed over the last 24 hours, but it's still, that risk still exists. The market is going to be worried that maybe one drone or one attack does take out a pipeline, a significant one, does take out an export facility, and that could cause damage that would last for weeks and months, and not something that can be fixed rather quickly.
In today's session, Asian equities are breathing, I think, a collective sigh of relief and moving higher. Talk to me a little bit about the vulnerability of many of the economies in the APAC region that are heavy oil importers and the risk of higher inflation. If this were to reverse course, oil prices were to move higher once more and remain at elevated levels.
Yeah, no, I mean, Asia is the biggest buyer of the oil and gas that comes out of the Gulf. Now, we're talking about a global market, but when you're actually talking about barrels and ships moving the fuel, a lot of them go to Asia. And while there are countries that are better placed to weather the storm, China has diversified their supply enough, both domestically and from other trade partners, that they are able to handle this at the moment. In the developed world, I'm talking Japan and South Korea, they've got large oil reserves, and they have systems where the government can subsidize to some degree oil and energy purchases, or they pass the cost down to consumers who are able to deal with it because they're richer than the developing world, which cannot necessarily take on that cost. So the shortages and those who are likely to feel the biggest pain, even now with oil prices in the $80 range, are nations in South and Southeast Asia. I'm talking Pakistan, India, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Pakistan and Bangladesh. And, those countries are, in particular, very dependent on oil and gas from the region. Pakistan, I know I said it twice, but it's just that important. They import 99% of their liquefied natural gas from Qatar, and that supply has stopped, which means that they've had to curb supply to fertilizer plants. There are also fears that LPG prices are rising quite quickly. LPG is a fuel used for cooking in households, so it's a really key commodity. And on top of that, you just have the general higher petrol prices. People are running to the pumps to get their gasoline. And while there are no shortages, because of the way that the Brent prices and the oil prices globally are rising, it just means higher costs for these consumers. And these consumers don't have the disposable income that those in the developed world had, and that it has a real strain on the consumer and the economies for these countries.
So at around 6 p.m. Wall Street time Monday, President Trump spoke with reporters in Miami, and he said he's planning to waive oil-related sanctions, and I'm wondering whether that's code for Russia, and what impact might a little bit more Russian oil have on global markets?
We actually already saw them waive some sanctions on Russian oil. They waived basically they gave waivers to India for oil, Russian oil that has been sanctioned that's already on the water. It's a 1-month waiver. And they were able to provide basically an opportunity for India, one of these hard-hit countries, kind of suck up this floating oil that had already been out there. Kind of, you imagine it as like a floating storage sort of situation, and suck that up. Now, that was helpful for India, but it's a bandage. Yes, providing, with Russian oil potentially flowing to other countries, with that being not impeded, it does provide some relief, but it is a bandage. When you look at the amount of oil that travels through the Strait of Hormuz, and the amount of oil that's being cut from the major producers in the Gulf, that just is so much larger than the waivers that the U.S. can give or what Russia can provide, at least in the short term. So again, it's a short-term solution, but it doesn't remove the risk, the volatility, and quite frankly, it's just still the elevated prices. $80, yes. We've dropped from the highs of earlier in the session on Monday, but still above where we were before the strikes, U.S. and Israel strikes on Iran began about more than a week ago.
That's a very good point. Stephen, thank you so very much. Bloomberg, Stephen Stapczynski, he is team leader for the Asia Energy Group, joining us from Singapore here on the Daybreak Asia podcast. Welcome back to the Daybreak Asia podcast. I'm Doug Krisner. The Australian government granted humanitarian visas to 5 members of the Iranian female soccer team. These players sought asylum, citing fear for their safety after they declined to sing the national anthem during a match on the Gold Coast last week. Now, Iranian state television reportedly labeled these players as traitors. That's where we begin our conversation with Craig Foster. Craig is a human rights activist and former captain for the Australia men's soccer team. Craig spoke with Bloomberg's Haidi Stroud-Watts.
Craig, you've been speaking out on behalf of these women for some days now. Tell us about your experience in terms of how this all transpired, particularly over the last 12 to 24 hours.
Yeah, the last day, Haiti, has been, really very quickly evolving situation, which often happens once it becomes not just public, but, very visible around the world. That generally does 2 things. One, it can provide some form of or level of protection to the athletes, because that notoriety means that, you've got more people who might be able to access them. You also, if they do leave Australia, either forcibly removed or decide to return back to Iran, we're hoping as well, which is why these interviews are important, that notoriety and the eyes of the global football community will be on them, which might hopefully afford them some level of protection. So in the last few days, we've been calling on the Asian Football Confederation and FIFA to step in. It was very clear that at least some, if not all, of the women were being placed in an environment of coercion, silencing, and a lack of safety and lack of security and very high risk. So the AFC had a responsibility. That's the Asian Football Confederation. They should have stepped in immediately several days ago, just to satisfy identify themselves that that wasn't the case. We've seen this too often with women athletes across a whole range of sports, and particularly in football, and it's clear that we don't have the systems and protocols in place to ensure that any of these women could have made, an SOS claim, if you like, through a trusted and confidential and private source. So this is where we've landed. We've landed in an environment where the Australian government has had to intervene, has been encouraged to intervene because of the risk factors that are obvious. We also know, the systematic persecution of high-profile athletes who've spoken out against the Iranian government over the course of many years. A lot of human rights campaigns have been run. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty and others have identified those systematic patterns. So that's why we've been so concerned about the group. And thankfully, an intervention by the Australian government allowed 5 of them to not only understand their rights but exercise them. The urgent and immediate situation today is to ensure that the rest of the group are not removed from Australia before having an opportunity to understand their rights and to make a personal decision about whether they would like to exercise them.
In terms of what transpired overnight, how useful, influential, impactful, or just in a matter of good timing was that conversation with President Trump?
Well, the Australian government was very aware of the situation prior to, was already working on the situation and was actually on the ground at least 48 hours ago. So I can't answer to that. I wasn't on the call. What I would say about these situations is we need to be a little bit careful in the over-politicisation of them. What's clear with these women is that they've already been in a deeply politicised environment by the Iranian government and the Iranian member federation. And of course, in the context of this conflict in which Iran is directly involved, so too is Australia and the US, these women can very easily be placed in a situation where the primary consideration is not their safety. It can be actually using them, as media tools, if you like. We've seen this, multiple times throughout football history and sporting history. The intersection of sport and politics, well, I shouldn't say intersection, they're basically one and the same. That's, and we've seen that in the way this Iranian women's team have been silenced, effectively held hostage in their hotel in order that they couldn't speak to the media or even access external support. So from our perspective, as a former player, former chair of our Players Association here in Australia, the only consideration should be the welfare and safety of this entire group. That's what we're really focused on. I think there was no question Australia was going to offer the women asylum anyway, independent of any phone call. It's the women who've shown the courage here. It's the activists around the hotel who've advocated, courageously for their rights. It's those people, I think, who are at the centre of this story.
Craig, you've done so much activism, and within this space, has it surprised you that this sort of path to bipartisan political support, to public support, has been easier to garner that attention and that broader support? Because we know that matters of asylum seeking, of refugees, of immigration can be quite difficult for Australia.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Australia, like many countries, has had a kind of tortured relationship with the concept of seeking asylum and of the protection of vulnerable and persecuted people. And so, we've had a lot of, public kind of angst around those issues, and our record on providing protection to people who seek it is very checkered, if you like. What we do see repeatedly is, a wonderful sense of compassion and care from Australians when particularly we see women in trouble, and that's important. We should be very proud, of the response of the Australian community to this moment. moment. Of course, we did grant asylum as well and evacuated the Afghan women's national team. Again, there were some political considerations around that because Australia was involved in that actual conflict and the like. Nonetheless, sport is so powerful in countries like Australia that it can provide a different context to a group. We saw this with the Hakeem Al Arabi campaign back in 2018-19. What saved his life was not the fact that he was in a Thai prison and we were able to secure his freedom. He was saved largely because he played football, and so he was seen as something more than just an asylum seeker or more than just a refugee. That's certainly the case here again. So my hope is always that Australians and other people around the world can respond to these situations by saying, well, if we feel strongly about this group of women, we should feel strongly about the rights of all women. That includes other asylum seekers and refugees, but it also includes all women in conflict. And it's a good opportunity for us in time, because it's still, a live, critical situation. But in time, we should reflect on, all of those issues, international law, where we sit in respect to that with Australia, because we should put no people at harm. But it is fantastic that Australia has responded to this group. We still need to make sure that the remaining members are safe, however.
That was Craig Foster, former captain of the Australian men's soccer team, speaking with Bloomberg's Haidi Stroud-Watts, bringing you their conversation here on the Daybreak Asia podcast. Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Bloomberg Daybreak Asia Edition podcast. Each weekday, we look at the stories shaping markets, finance, and geopolitics in the Asia Pacific. You can find us on Apple, Spotify, the Bloomberg Podcast YouTube channel, or anywhere else you listen. Join us again tomorrow for insight on the market moves from Hong Kong to Singapore and Australia. I'm Doug Krisner, and this is Bloomberg.